So when you want to study the Gospels, what's the first place you go to? Well, that would be Revelation. And we're in Revelation 4, verse 7 to 8. Todd, where are you at? There he is.
In the center, around the throne, were four living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion. The second was like an ox. The third had a face like a man. The fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the four living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all around, even under its wings.
Now, we also see the same imagery in Ezekiel 1:10. And since we're trying to cover prophecy in this, I thought we'd cover that. Ezekiel 1:10, Todd.
Their faces looked like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces.
So why did we start here? Why did I have him read those passages in Revelation and Ezekiel? Mari.
The different aspects, the different faces represent the different descriptions of Jesus in the gospel.
That's right. So, and some churches will refer to it as the 4 evangelists, or as they're described in there. We'll get into that a little bit more, but this is called a tetramorph. It's a symbolic arrangement of 4 different elements, or the combination of 4 elements into one unit. And you'll see this if anybody ever traveled through Europe and been in any of the cathedrals over here and stuff. I know a lot of you have. You'll see this kind of imagery in the artwork in these cathedrals in Europe. This one, ironically, is at St. Mark's Anglican Church, and they hired an artist to paint those images in their church there. So it does represent. I want to take a look at that passage in Revelation one more time, because it does give you an idea of what we're looking at. Now, Len's going through Matthew, and Matthew represents, the first gospel shows Jesus as king, also the tribe of Judah like a lion. And I think that comes through pretty clear in Matthew so far. Mark, and I hope this isn't a commentary on myself, the second living creature is an ox, representing the Gospel of Mark, that being a domestic servant animal. And in this gospel, I think we'll see it even today as we just do the introduction, Jesus is represented as a servant. You're not going to have a lot of lengthy discourses in Mark. You're not going to see the Sermon on the Mount in Mark. You're going to see action in the Gospel of Mark. And then in Luke, that represents the Lord as Son of Man. His humanity is emphasized in this gospel. And then later, and Bart will be teaching that when I'm done with Mark, and then Len will come back. He's going to teach the Gospel of John, which really focuses on the deity of Christ. Mike and I were talking this morning. You get that when you get to John, it is right in your face, right from the get-go. In the beginning was the Word, and goes right into it to let you know that he's going to be talking about the deity of Christ. Okay. Now, over the centuries, different traditions have connected the faces in different ways. One of them was, again, thinking the Gospel of Mark is the ox. And again, it shows Jesus in action. We're going to see some of that today. It's a very busy book. It goes very quickly. Mark uses the word immediately over 40 times in a little over 15 chapters of this gospel. And you'll see that again when we look at some of these, a few of the verses we're going to see today. It just starts right in. Immediately after he got baptized, he went here. And immediately he went to the synagogue and he started teaching there. And immediately he was approached by a man who was possessed by a demon. And immediately Jesus cast him out. You'll see it again in the first, Mike and I were talking this morning, in the first 20 verses, you use immediately 4 or 5 times. So that's the way Mark kind of writes this gospel. But again, we see Jesus as a servant. So it's busy on, the gospel is busy on deeds and works. And we get to see that very clearly in his gospel. It's Christ in action. And like I said, there's a minimum of discourse. It's not like some of the other gospels that are written in such detail and they cover sermons and different things And not that some of that isn't covered. There are teachings from Jesus, obviously, in Mark, but it's not in the same way that Matthew and Luke really present those. So let's take a look here. Here's what we know about Mark. Todd, you want to read that?
Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas' cousin Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him.
Okay, so the first thing we know about Mark is he is a cousin to Barnabas. Now, who's Barnabas?
All sidekick.
Paul's sidekick. You know anything else, Alan?
Son of encouragement. That's the reason why we call Barnabas.
Okay. All right, so he is a cousin to Barnabas, so that's pretty good. He was also the son of Mary, who provided the meeting place for early Christians. Todd, go ahead and read Acts 12:12.
And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying.
So we know that he was raised in a good home. How many people in this room were raised as a child in a Christian home? Man, you guys are so lucky. I was born to be a backsliding Catholic, and really didn't change until I met Patsy. So if you were raised in a good Christian home like that, you praise God every day for that. There's a lot of mistakes I've made in my life that probably wouldn't have happened if that had been the environment I was raised in. What we don't know about, we don't know for sure, but we think, a lot of scholars think that Mark inserted himself into his own gospel. And this is in chapter 14, verses 51, 52.
A young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him. But he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked.
Mike said this was the first documentation of a streaker in recorded history. We don't know for sure if that's Mark, but a lot of scholars tend to think that that's Mark inserting himself into this as he was writing this. Now he's writing it much later. And we know that he accompanied Barnabas and Saul on their first missionary. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being on a missionary trip with Barnabas and Saul? You think that was intimidating? You think it was enlightening? It had to be a powerful time for him. But it goes on and it creates a little rift, actually. Let's read 12:25, Todd.
And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark.
And then in 13:13.
Now Paul and his companions put out to sea from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, but John left them and returned to Jerusalem.
Why do you think John, he's probably a pretty young man still at this point, why do you think John left them? Any speculation? I don't have an answer. I'm just asking you. Anyone?
A couple of things maybe, he could have been, he could have been afraid of persecution. Or he could have had news of something going on at home, but he felt like he had to attend to.
It could have been homesick. It could have been a bunch of things. We don't know for sure. Alan?
We do know that by the place where it says he left them, they were getting ready to go across some very, very high and rugged mountains. In fact, the trip on the first journey to those cities, you couldn't have gotten there without having a very arduous journey. And Paul was a go-getter. He didn't put up with anything. It wasn't a matter of getting it all done. And whatever God said to him, he got done. And I have an idea that kind of pressed Mark too far.
Yeah, that's exactly. When you read through those accounts, it's kind of, I was thinking, yeah, it had to be tough traveling with Paul. It's like sitting down and praying with Alvin. Anybody ever had an opportunity to sit down and pray with Alvin? I love it. But one of the things when you pray with Alvin, it is very challenging. You're not going to get some fluffy prayer time. When you pray with Alvin, you are getting very in your face. I've never heard anybody pray for some of the things that Alvin prays for. Okay. I've never prayed for desire for God's word until I prayed with that man. Okay. And some of that can be intimidating when you're a young Christian, which I was. that's can be intimidating. So I can only imagine what Mark is going through as a young man traveling with Paul. Okay. Now, it does cause a bit of a kerfuffle with Barnabas and Paul, and we see that in Acts 15:37-39. Todd.
Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia, had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus.
That's interesting. Paul, now this is Luke is documenting this. The description is he deserted them. So Paul was really kind of upset over what had happened. Let's forget what the age of the young man is. He was upset, but it does lead to something. You ever notice anything in here? What does it lead to?
It's two missionaries.
Exactly. That's right. You're covering twice as much ground now with two of them split up. The other thing is Barnabas is beginning some restoration with Mark. You know, it's one thing to be called out by the Apostle Paul. It's another thing to have your cousin have your back and help build you up. And you'll see that later when in Philemon and in his letter to Timothy, Paul speaks very highly of Mark. He's, bring him with you. He's useful to me in my ministry. Okay, so there is some restoration that does happen there. Jack, do you have any?
I want to go back to the traveling. We don't think about this a lot when we read the ancient texts about what so-and-so went here and so-and-so went there. But people walked or rode an animal. So they either went 4 to 10 miles an hour on these trips, unless they were going on a boat. And you read about George Washington, one day he's in Trenton, the next day he's in Valley Forge. Like we think he gets on a bus and he rides over to Valley Forge. But these trips were arduous. I mean, it's mind-boggling when you think about what they had to do to get a short distance, 100 miles. If they were going to Lexington, it would take days.
Oh, yeah.
And we forget about that when we read the scriptures. And of course, Jesus was in a relatively small geographic area, but Paul's missionary journeys, in Bible college, I had to do a study on the 4 missionary journeys.
Mhm.
It's a lifetime just to get where he went.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the thought, we don't really think about it in the
But
context.
that's one of the problems sometimes when you're just reading through scripture, you're not really, thinking about these things. When we did Ezra and he's bringing them out of captivity. Well, how far was Jerusalem from where they were in captivity? It's over 1,000 miles. That trip took a while, a long while. Like you said, you're not hopping on a Greyhound to go back to Jerusalem.
What the major problem is security. There was no security of any kind, so they could get robbed.
Oh, yeah.
I know this.
Yeah. Again,
Not only were the journeys arduous, they didn't have motels along the way. They didn't have McDonald's to get a bite to eat. They were very dependent.
yeah.
Didn't have, I don't even think, I can't picture Paul with a sack of money over his shoulder, and
I know.
being able to fly his way through. So he traveled for weeks or months to get to a place over a very arduous thing. It's physically demanding in your resources. You gotta know.
That's right. That's right. Here.
It's made me realize how much God provided for them.
Oh, absolutely.
Had to come.
Think of when Ezra was going back out of captivity. What did he leave with? Do you remember when we talked about this? He had a ton, I mean, literal ton of money, gold and silver and everything. I mean, he was a ripe target to be pilfered from on that trip. I mean, the fact that God protected them in that way is a miracle in itself. It really is.
I was just wondering how you said he was a young man.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a Bible study this week and they were talking about the disciples. And I never had realized that they were to be from 13 years up, not very old. And, I just wonder if he was in that age too.
Well, I think he was very young. We'll get into a little bit more here in a bit. I'll ask, this is out of order here, but was Mark an apostle? No, no. Did he get to travel and see Jesus' teachings? Probably not.
He was that guy.
We don't know. That's right. That's exactly right. We don't know for sure.
How long was this after the resurrection and ascension, or when the church started? How long was this after the church began?
Are you talking about the references in Acts?
Yes, all this, Martin.
I don't, Jack, you have any idea what period of time that would be? I don't know for sure. Kim,
These are all arbitrary, but the dates of the Bible for the gospel is in the 50s.
well, this
So you
Mark's
have to
gospel.
estimate that it's probably somewhere around 20 years later.
Yeah, the best estimates, and again, we're getting a little louder, so if I repeat myself later, you'll know why. But the best estimates are that this book was written somewhere in the 50s, between 50 and 59 AD. And they know part of that is because we know that he was martyred in AD 68. Okay, right around there. Alvin.
According to the writings of the early fathers, Mark ended up being the translator for Peter when Peter was in Rome.
Hang on to that thought. You're going to get ahead of me here. That's exactly where I'm headed, though. Alvin is exactly right. You know, evidently Mark had a special relationship with Peter. Not only does Peter refer to him as son in 1 Peter 5, but they both experienced some failure and restoration. And they probably had a kindred spirit from that standpoint. If you look at some of the other, again, it's unanimous, the early church fathers, it's unanimous that they think Mark wrote this book. But he did have this special relationship with Peter. And go ahead and read this one, Todd.
Papias, bishop of Hierapolis, writing about AD 140, noted, and the presbyter, the apostle John, said this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered.
So that leads us to one of the things that a lot of people think, that the Gospel of Mark, while it is truly written by Mark, is really a retelling of the stories that Peter taught him when they were traveling together. Okay. Anybody know what a presbyter is? Alvin, go ahead.
There's an explanation behind this, and I'm just filling in the gaps on
That's
this.
what I
Well, okay, there was and that is Mark's mother's house was the place of meeting of a
Right.
large prayer meeting.
That's right.
Okay, that meant that they were people of means. Mark grew up in Jerusalem, which was a place of an educated people. None of the apostles were that educated. And so for Mark to end up being a translator in the Greek language for him, he grew up in Jerusalem. He would have been educated. And then later, he was the founder of a Christian seminary in Alexandria.
That's
So
right. Which ironically is where he ends up being martyred as well.
And so this is a man that after his failure ended up really being a remarkable spreader of the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the most important churches in those early plantings, was the church in Alexandria. Mari.
Picking up your question, presbyter, I think it's elder.
That's right. That's right. In fact, the Presbyterian Church still calls them presbyters, or elders in their church. That's right. So we see that Mark is probably, and we're going to get into some of the other details here in a bit. He had accompanied Peter on his trips, and make no mistake, I'm sure that what he was taught, he's written down faithfully. I don't think there's anything added. I think there's a few things that probably weren't in Mark. We're going to look at that in a second. But I think that's not on Mark. I think that's how things were related to him from Peter. Justin Martyr, writing in AD 150, referred to the Gospel of Mark as the memoirs of Peter. He suggested that Mark wrote the Gospel in Italy. And this agrees. Well, I don't, I don't know, and someone smarter than me, but how about Peter's epistles? Did he write those?
Yeah.
He had to write those, okay? I'm not quite sure why this wouldn't have been the Gospel of Peter. He, obviously he could have written it, but for some reason, I don't know if it was deliberate or it was just Mark paying attention to the stories over a period of years and decided to write the gospel. Okay. And then in AD 185, Irenaeus called Mark the disciple and interpreter for Peter. And he noted that the second gospel consists of what Peter preached about Christ. And evangelical scholars even suggested the dates of ranging from AD 50 to 70, but most people now think that it was probably in the 50s for sure, certainly before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple.
The earliest gospel.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Think about that. We're talking about documents that are coming up on 2,000 years old. And think about how accurate they are. Think about, what really gets me on the word being handled so carefully is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. One of the things, but at the time, those were discovered in what, 47, 48. Okay. You know what the earliest manuscript for the book of Isaiah that we had prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls? It was about AD 1000. Okay. Not that old. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, anybody been to the museum in Jerusalem? The centerpiece of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the book of Isaiah. And that dated back to 10 BC. Oh, it's 1,000 years earlier than the manuscript that we had before. And it is near identical. The only changes being, a comma here or there or something like that. But word for word, 1,000 years, there is no change. It gives it a lot more credibility when you think about something that old. Just coincidental? Yeah, get out. Yeah, that's what's amazing to me is the care and accuracy of which they handled God's word, including passing it down. Why do you think like the Gospels really are stories, right? They're really collections of stories. Why is it written that way? Why did Jesus teach in parables? Because stories are easy to remember. Easier to understand, and they're easier to remember. That's why it's done that way. Let me see what if you look at the writings, Mark seems to have targeted Roman believers. They believe it was written in Italy, particularly Gentiles. And when he uses Aramaic terms, Mark spoke Aramaic, he translates them. He uses different terms throughout the Gospel of Mark, and he gives you translations of it. When he says, he's talking about in 3:17, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to them he gave the names Boanerges, I don't know how you pronounce that, which means sons of thunder. Okay, so he's giving you a definition, and then he's giving you he's giving you an Aramaic term, and then giving you the translation. If a man says to his father or his mother, "Whatever I have would help you," is Corban. What does Corban mean? Well, he tells you, that is to say, given to God. Okay, you'll find that throughout, and there's just a couple examples. In the crucifixion, it says they brought him to a place called Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. Anybody ever been there? It's an amazing, unfortunately, it's deteriorating over the years, but it's amazing place. And he also omits a lot of Jewish elements, such as the genealogies that you find in Matthew and you find in Luke. You don't find those in Mark. Okay? Because to his reader, they probably wouldn't have been important. And it makes the fewest references to the Old Testament of any of the Gospels. I had to thank Len. I said, well, thank you for giving me Mark as you want to teach prophecy through the Gospels, because there's very little of it in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, there's only about 3 or 4 references in the entire Gospel, several of which Len will have covered by the time he gets done, including John the Baptist. It starts with John the Baptist. So you're going to get very few Old Testament references. And then things like talking about the Pharisees and Sadducees, he only mentions the Sadducees one time in his gospel. Think about how many times it's talked about, Jesus talking about them in Matthew. Quite a bit. And then in 1521, he mentions Simon the Cyrene, and then Mark identifies him as the father of Rufus. Who is Rufus? Anybody know? He was a prominent member of the church in Rome. So he's probably making some of those references to get credibility as he's writing this in Italy. So like I said earlier, Mark is viewed as an interpreter for Peter. And why do we say that we think Peter or Mark wrote Peter's account? Well, first of all, is the writing style. It's consistent with Mark's background. The traditional view recognizes Mark as a Palestinian Jew who wrote his gospel using Peter as his source. That's from John MacArthur. Most scholars believe the Gospel of Mark demonstrates a writing style and literary syntax, exposing the author's first language as something other than Greek. And that's why you see so many incidents where he's giving you a translation. In addition to this, the Gospel of Mark includes a number of vivid and tangible details unnecessary to the narrative, but consistent with the observations of an eyewitness of the events. In other words, if Mark wasn't around during Jesus' time, he wasn't following around, he couldn't have made some of the points that he makes, these little tiny details. That's another reason I love the Bible so much, is these ridiculous details that seem so unimportant, okay? But who does that? Well, the person who was right there, the person who observed these things, and you throw details in because it's part of the story. Mark wouldn't have been there, okay? So Peter had to teach him some of those things. Second thing is the outline of the gospel is consistent with Peter's outline. And by that, I mean, when you look at the way Peter preached, starting right in book of Acts 1, Peter's always limited his preaching to the public life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. If you look at his sermons, that is the order which he is teaching. Okay, and that's exactly what you'll see in the Gospel of Mark. Mark begins by preaching John the Baptist and ends with the resurrection and ascension, paralleling the public sermons that Peter did. And then last, the omissions of the gospel are consistent with Peter's influence. There's many details in the book, in Peter's life and in the book of Mark that vary, I'll say widely, but they vary quite a bit from some of the other gospels. It's interesting because we tend to use the term, these are synoptic gospels. What does that mean? Similar, okay? And they are similar. They tell, the same stories, but details from gospel writer to gospel writer can vary widely depending on who's doing the writing, okay? Now, the vast majority of the omissions from the Gospel of Mark involve stories about Peter. Now, why do you think there would be omissions? If you're the interpreter for Peter, you're writing what he's telling you, why would there be omissions about Peter? Patsy and I are talking. If I wrote a memoir of my life, I would tell a lot of stories, okay? I would probably change some of the details in some of them because they would be too embarrassing for me to relate publicly, even though other people were there and know the public details. I think there's a sense of that as we look at these details or omissions, if you will. Let's take a look at a couple of these. Okay, So this is Mark's account. This is in chapter 1. His account of Jesus telling them to let down the nets on their boat. Todd, go ahead and read that. This is Mark 1:16-20.
As he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were also in the boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and went away to follow him.
Okay, so there's two more immediately, and we're still in chapter 1 here. What's missing from the story in other accounts? Did you pick up on it? What's that?
All the fish.
Well, not only that, anything else? Let's take a look. This is kind of a long section here, but Todd, let's read Luke 5:1-11. This is Luke's account of the same story we just read in Mark. First of all, notice how much longer the story is. Go ahead, Todd.
Now it happened that while the crowd was pressing around him and listening to the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw 2 boats lying at the edge of the lake. But the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from the land. And he sat down and began teaching the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered and said, "Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. But I will do as you say and let down the nets."
All right, hang on there for just a second. What is Peter saying here? Are you crazy? I'm a fisherman. I'm a professional fisherman. Okay. And we were fishing all night. We've caught nothing. And now you want us to drop our nets right here? He was faithful. I'll give him that. But he has a little doubt in his mind, doesn't he? He has a little lack of faith here. Go ahead, Todd.
When they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat for them to come and help them. And they came and filled both of the boats, so that they began to sink. And when Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For amazement had seized him and all his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not fear. From now on, you will be catching men." When they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him.
You see the significant difference in the telling of those two stories? Now, why is Mark different?
Peter doesn't talk about himself.
Peter doesn't talk about himself because it's not real flattering.
Have to be told, they were just called. Apparently, he's saying in Mark that they were just called. Jesus just now called them, so they haven't been, I don't know, we don't know how long they've been observing Jesus.
Not long, that's right.
Probably not long. So I don't think that's unreasonable for him to, well, I don't know why he wouldn't want that known, but maybe not.
I don't know, what do you think? And we're talking about the first pope here, right? I don't want any letters or emails about that, okay? Yeah. I think he views it as a flaw for himself at that time. Yeah. You know, Peter was a heck of an apostle. Okay, but he probably doesn't like the way he comes off in that story. That's a pretty pertinent detail to just leave out. Yeah, so I can imagine you sitting there, so Jesus asked me to put the nets down. I'm like, hang on a second. I'm a fisherman here. We've done this all night. There's nothing out there. Boy, he probably didn't want to have that part of the story get told, especially for a man of such tremendous faith. I'm sorry.
What translation is that?
NASB.
That shows that it is in fact that is true. he would rather, he's thinking more about himself than letting anyone know the great miracle that Jesus did.
Jack.
A lot of it has to do with pride of your profession. It's like
Yeah.
going in and telling somebody, walking off the street and telling some baseball player how to hit the baseball, and you've never played baseball. There's a lot of resentment from a professional in a job for somebody to come in and doesn't, never done that job.
Yeah.
And that's what you got here. You know, you never fished a day in your life. You're gonna come in here and tell me how to fish.
Exactly.
They didn't have a good feel for who Jesus was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, I used to have that kind of pride when it came to the electronics business. I knew my business inside and out. No one was going to come in and tell me otherwise. And I had a little bit of an arrogant streak on it. Alvin.
Maybe Peter was Jesus could have said, Peter, I created the fish.
Exactly. Yeah.
Get them in your net in the heart.
Jesus could have responded in a whole lot of ways there, couldn't you? Back here.
Isn't it amazing how Jesus presented to fishermen his deity, his
Yeah.
Godhead in a
See, I
way
think
that they would understand it the best?
It's a wonderful story. And he is revealing some of his deity right then and there. Alvin.
Interesting that Jesus does the same miracle at the beginning of his ministry and at the end of his.
Yeah.
With the same person.
And that's something, evidently it was a lesson that need to be taught twice. You know, this lessons that you learn more than once are the ones that stick with you. My dad would tell you that in a heartbeat raising me. But again, I mentioned this earlier, if you wrote a memoir for yourself, you know, how would you paint the stories? The ones that you think are unflattering. I can see the desire to do that. O.J. Simpson wrote a memoir. How do you think those stories were recounted? Of course, he was an idiot. The name of the book was If I Did It, Confessions of the Killer. That was the name of his memoir. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's the name of the book that O.J. Simpson wrote sometime after his wife was murdered. And then today you catch people relating stories, even if they're really truthful, and they get called out in our cancel culture, and they go, "Oh, well, I misremembered. I didn't even know that was a word." Okay, misremember. We use it all the time now. It's probably in the dictionary. Why is the present day so interested in history of America and rewrite it? Why do we have revisionist history going on in this country all the time? Terry.
Well, Karl Marx said if you can separate people from their history, then you can control them.
Okay. What else?
Our history are not printed.
Oh, and I don't think anybody could say otherwise.
But there was a strain of character that I think galls many of the woke people. You know, many of our founders, they were either Christians or they were respectful of Christianity. Well, the people today that are rewriting it, they're not Christians and they're not respectful of Christianity.
Why are we going around tearing down statues? Christopher Columbus is, get out of here. We got to get rid of him in history. Why?
Doesn't fit a narrative.
Doesn't fit the present day narrative. Karen.
On a tour in Germany, and I could not help but notice this contrast. They left up everything about Hitler, and they say to us, we're not proud of it, but it happened and we don't want to forget. And it's so different from what we're doing.
You know what the German government did after World War II? Because they had a lot of people not believing the stories that came out about the atrocities against Jews. They made every person from those surrounding areas that were close to those camps, they made every person in Germany go visit those camps so that you couldn't say, well, I didn't know. Now you know. Okay. And I'm sure they would love to change that history, but they seem to embrace it. And when you walk around different areas of Germany, they still have bombed out areas that they've not fixed. They're just a constant reminder of what happened in World War II. Jack.
thing is they separate us from our Christian heritage.
Oh,
They-
absolutely.
They want to, remove Christ and the idea of a religious devotion totally out of our culture. And you can see things going on in academia, in government, in business. And I'm glad I retired when I did, because I'd have been in fighting everybody at UPS.
Oh,
The woke things that are going on in our companies and in academia is unbelievable.
Yeah, Jack, I've only been retired 4 years, and I'm thankful that I got out when I did, because you're already starting to see some of these kind of things creeping in a company that I never thought you would see those kinds of things. But it seems to be inevitable. And you talk about academia, this has been going on for how many years? At least 4 decades, really 6, 7, or 8. I mean, you can go back to early 1900s and see some of the things that people were trying to take out of school or put into school. Okay.
And heavy in the '60s.
In the 60s, yeah. They took prayer out of school. That, that kind of was the beginning of the end there. Todd, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like tearing down the statues and everything, it's all about making the culture forget so that they can change the history. So by tearing down these statues, you're forgetting your history, you're forgetting where you came from. So now that somebody can come in and tell you, this is why we're a racist or oppressive country. This is why you need to do things this way.
Yeah.
It is a way to change.
Yeah, that's one of the main, real dangers about teaching evolution, is that it separates you from the image of God. And now they've got this story to tell you that you're no different than any other animal because of evolution. Derek.
Did you see this past week where the Google chat bot Gemini? You asked a question like, show me American Revolutionary soldiers. You would get black females and black men. Show me a pope. You got a black female, American Indian, black man. Show me American women, only black. Show me British women, only black. They kind of erase the whole idea of anybody white.
What's the problem with AI? The problem with AI is who programmed it. Okay. The other thing I saw in the same article was they're asking the machine, the Google machine, about, is pedophilia morally wrong? And this thing could not give it an answer that yes, it was. Couldn't say no.
Upset Muslims.
Don, I can tell you something funny real quick. I know you want to move on, but they took a Confederate statue down at U of L, and of course, all those statues were done to bring unity back to the communities. But if you go down to Brandenburg, Kentucky right now, that statue is on the riverfront of Brandenburg, Kentucky.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's on the my family's from Meade County, and we were down at Brandenburg, and there's the Confederate statues right on the riverfront.
I mean, I don't get it. I mean, okay, I don't think there's anybody that's going to tell you that slavery was a good thing. I don't think anybody's going to tell you that the Confederates were on the wrong side of that issue during the war. Okay. But wiping out statues and memorials or anything else doesn't change any of those things. It makes you feel better going forward, evidently, but it doesn't change anything.
I think you're right on target. I think it's because they want man to believe man is good and there's no need for God.
Oh, yeah. Isn't that the biggest lie ever foisted upon mankind? Men are generally good. What's wrong with that? It's not. My father, who was an agnostic his entire life, literally until days before his death, he would tell you, you have to teach a child goodness. Being naughty happens naturally. I've told you the story before. My 3-year-old brother at the time, he was walking up to grandma with his steel fire truck that he got for Christmas, and he was going to bash grandma in the head with this metal fire truck. Dad catches him before he does it and gives him a swat on the butt, and grandma's all upset. Why are you hitting that boy? Because he was about to pound your head in. That's why. You don't have to teach that. That comes naturally. You think anybody taught him to do that kind of violence? Happens naturally. Bobby.
The one thing too about him going to fishermen, I've always thought this. Why he didn't go to the well-educated. He went to the guys who were in bar rooms fighting at night. So when Peter started doing his message, the people in his area that knew him said, man, God really changed him.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They had influence because of the
Absolutely.
work they did in his life, same
Right.
as what happened to you. You were in a church that slept 400, now you're teaching.
Yeah. No, that's.
Praise God.
Exactly. And I told you this story before. I was very fortunate. God was very fortunately put me in the path of tremendous people. First one was Patsy. I hadn't stepped foot in a church in 15 years until I met her. Okay. The other was, I used to sit next to this guy. He still works at Samtec. His name is Danny Bosing. You've heard me talk about him before. And he and I used to be kindred spirits. I mean, when we would go out traveling, I took him around to teach him everything, drinking, staying up late, doing all the other things you do when you travel and you're young. And in 1 week, we went out on another trip, and the person I saw was not the same person. He literally changed overnight. He didn't cuss anymore. He didn't drink anymore. He brought his Bible, his reading material wasn't Sports Illustrated anymore. It was the Bible. Like that. I mean, I'm talking about from a Thursday, the previous week, to Monday, the next week. This was a completely different guy. And I was fortunate enough to sit by him and have him work for me for a number of years. And he was a tremendous example of being a new creature in Christ. And I'm sure Peter exhibited that same thing. Like you said, Bobby, this is a rough profession to be in. So, Karen.
The sense of these guys, they were looking for Jesus. They went to each other and said, we have found him. We have found him. So they were Jews. They were believing Jews. They weren't Gentile sinners. They were looking for Messiah.
They weren't completely uneducated or unaware, that's for sure.
Andrew went to Peter. We found him. And then somebody else goes to Nathaniel. We found him, of whom Moses and the prophets looked.
I always think that's kind of funny. We found him. Who found who? But your point is well taken. Absolutely.
With that verse, 'cause I don't think that's who they were.
Yeah.
So the second thing we need to be aware of is this Christian nationalism label that's coming on us.
Oh, yeah.
Now, if you believe rights are God-given, you are now in this group of, we want to take over the world is the thing now.
Yeah.
And I want to say to this lady, why don't you read the Declaration of Independence? We are endowed by our Creator with these inalienable rights, but that's our new
Why do they apply that moniker to Christians? Christian nationalists. What's the real implication?
over Trump.
Okay, but why that description?
We want to take it over.
That's right. And we're gonna punish you if you do all these things.
Well, the nasty word in here is nationalists.
Yeah.
When was the last country that had a large population of nationalists? Germany. And they're trying to tie Trump people, okay, and I'm not going to get into the politics. They're trying to tie them to that. Words you have me. Jacob, you got your hand up or are you just stretching? Just stretching, okay. Mike.
Jan Harrington's online and she asked a question. If scripture is God breathed, is there a conflict with how Mark's gospel was told him by Peter?
Great question. I personally don't see a problem with it. If it is God breathed, then the Holy Spirit led Mark to write what he did based on what he knew. Okay, so I don't see a conflict. Anybody else? Jack, you got any thoughts on that? I don't see a
A
problem.
lot of the Bible was written by people who heard it by word of mouth.
Yeah.
They didn't all experience what they wrote about.
Yeah. All right, let's look at another example here.
What Karen just said. It should not be a surprise to people who know the Bible of what we're seeing right now. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3. Knowing this, first of all, that in the last days, mockers will come with their mockery, following after their own lusts. Now that's what we are. That's the whole foundation of much of what is now in our colleges, in the gut response of our leaders. I mean, that is what we're seeing.
Yeah, think about Kyle's last two sermons. I didn't see today, so exclude that. But think about the last two sermons he's done about being in the sin circle and being outside. And that's what you're seeing in the environment today is you got people who are placing themselves outside the circle and telling you got a problem. You're a Christian nationalist. That's a problem. You know, and that's the more we get into we get further down the road, the more the Bible becomes more relevant as far as I'm concerned. Every time I read it, I can't help but look at what's going on in the world today and realizing this has all been predicted. You know, Pat and I were talking the other night. As bad as things are, and we think things are bad right now, they ain't bad at all compared to what they're going to be. Okay. The only question is, are we going to be around to see that? Well, we hope not. All right, Todd, let's give another example here. This is Jesus walking on water. This is Mark's account in chapter 6.
When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished.
All right, what's missing out of this story?
It's him getting out of the boat.
But I look at this story as Peter's the only guy that got out of the boat. You know, wasn't there a sermon? You can't walk on water unless you get out of the boat. You know, Peter did that. I would have liked to have included that. I don't care if I was starting to sink or not. It's a great lesson. And so if you go to Matthew's account, just again, think about how succinct that story was in Mark. Jacob, do you have a question? You're not stretching them time?
No, I was gonna say, I mean, he's the one that had the faith to go, Jesus, if you command it, let me walk on water. Nobody else said that.
Exactly. Nobody said it. Nobody thought it. Peter gets out of the boat and he did walk on water. Yeah. I tell you what, if that were me, I'd be telling that story. That's pretty cool. Name another mortal that walked on water. Don't think so. Todd, go ahead and read this is Matthew's account.
And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid."
Okay, so this first section here is near identical to the story that Mark's telling.
Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are certainly God's son."
You know, when you look at some of these stories, when I think about when someone says, you know, hey, you remember the story about Jesus walking on water? What's the second thing you think of? Peter getting out of the boat. And yet he doesn't put that in, or Mark doesn't put it in. And again, I can only assume that maybe that's because he was embarrassed by the fact that Jesus said, "Oh, you have little faith." I had a lot of faith just to get out of the boat. Tony.
Gospel is not about. I'm saying, I'm the guy that walked on water. He's not going to say.
You brought that up. How are the gospel writers identified in their writing? They're not. The gospels don't identify who the writers are. All the epistles do. Yeah, exactly. But he doesn't come right out and say that it's him as the writer. And we do know through some of the teachings, you know, that they voted unanimously that Mark wrote this book, but they're not identified. It's about Christ. But when you start getting into the gospel message in the epistles, in Apostle Paul, he always identifies who's writing. Peter identifies. Every epistle identifies who the writer is, but not the gospel, because it's not about them. It is about Christ. Jeff.
Interesting thing about that, Peter identifies himself, as does John in his writing, not as an apostle, but as an elder.
As what?
As an elder,
Yes.
which is something I talk about a lot when I'm working with elders, that the apostles something from apostles into elders.
That's right.
And all of us who are elders and have been elders are in the line of the apostles, because that was the plan.
Yeah, at some point they become elders because they were planting churches and everything else. So they do transition out of that. Any other thoughts on that? All right, the last example. Go ahead.
Go back to that Mark passage.
Um,
Yeah, to the Mark passage.
This one?
And I never noticed that before. He said he came to them walking on the sea and he intended to pass by them.
Yes.
Well, that wasn't in, the one you read in Matthew, and I never noticed that he wasn't particularly walking to the boat, but he intended to pass by them and maybe go to the shore. I never noticed that.
You think Jesus really just intended to go by him and not be noticed?
Well, if he
It
says.
it says that. I mean, I'm with you. It does say that. I don't know that anyone walking on water is going to go unnoticed in any way. I mean, I liken it a little bit to when Jesus healed some people and he said, now don't tell anybody. And then immediately they went out and told everyone. You know, you think Jesus knew that was going to happen? Of course he did. All right, and then the last one. This is Mark's account of the Last Supper.
While they were eating, he took some bread, and after blessing, he broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take it, this is my body." And when he had taken the cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I say to you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." After singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
All right, so what's missing on this account? No, what's missing?
The story of Judas, he told to go.
Okay, that's missing. What else is missing?
Stand behind me,
Look
say,
at the picture. Look at the picture. Todd, go ahead and read it. You can pick up from verse 5 there.
Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered and said to him, "What I do to you, what I do, you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter." Peter said to him, "Never shall you wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head."
Can you believe there's someone like Peter that just says whatever comes to his mind like that? Patsy, can you believe that? It's an integral part of the story. Look what I've done for you. Do you realize I didn't come to be served? I came to serve. You know, the other account on it. You know, I'm a little surprised that account is not in there of Mark. And again, if Mark is, and all their early historians seem to believe that he was the interpreter for Peter, then this was probably told to him by Peter in that fashion. And again, it's another example. Sometimes you ever use your own humility to make a point with someone you're talking to? I do it to my kids all the time. I tell them all the goofy stuff I did when I was growing up. not because it makes me look good or look bad, but because there's a lesson to be involved in there. And I think sometimes when we do some of the stuff, in Peter's case, I think he might have left the best pieces of him, but as I don't know, Karen said earlier, this isn't about him, it's about Jesus. But the washing the feet and the lesson about coming to serve, not be served, I think would have been a high point in there.
Scripture as inspired by God. Each one of these has in it exactly what it's supposed to have.
Exactly.
And it's not, God decided, it doesn't have to be in 1 4 3 hours. It's not to read it somewhere else.
Well, think about this. If the four gospels were near identical, they kind of tell the same story and from different perspectives. But if they were near identical, would you deep dive into each one of them? Well, why should I read Mark? I just read and studied Matthew. Why should I do that? You know, I think some of these things are put in there to intrigue us, to get us to dive into these things a little more. I have thought a lot about the person of Christ, the person of Peter, and why some of these, think about that. I've dwelled on that for, dozens of hours this week, just to think, why did Peter leave that out? Like I said, the walking on water, man, I'd have been singing that from the rooftops if that were me. I don't care if I sank a little afterwards or not.
He was a,
Go ahead.
Chuck Colson has said that if all four gospels were alike, you would assume there was collusion among the witnesses.
Exactly.
As a lawyer, he knew that.
That's
And
exactly right.
cases of all the witnesses said the same thing.
That's what makes the gospel so intriguing. And that's why we started with the four faces in Revelation and also Ezekiel, because they have different perspectives. Matthew is definitely from a Jewish perspective. Mark is definitely not. He's in Italy and he's teaching Gentiles more than anything. John later is going to be all about the deity of Christ. That's what keeps you diving into the gospels, is those differences.
it's Peter shows that he's a tough guy, because in Mark, he talks about cutting off that ear.
Oh yeah.
See, he
Lent
was
up to
a
it, yeah.
tough dude.
Yeah.
And you can say, well, they were Jews, they were more educated, but they were fishermen. And they didn't play.
Yeah.
It was a tough generation.
A lot of this is the dynamics of a small group, because you can tell that the other writers think Peter's kind of a hot dog. And they take some shots at him.
That's true.
And that's group dynamics. You
Yeah.
gotta think about, these guys were together all the time. And
Yeah.
the inner workings of that small group are very fascinating. Really like to see a psychological profile of that.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, think about that. Maybe they were taking some shots at him. He was the head hog of the trough. Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
He said it again.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Well, anyway, that gives you a brief intro to Mark. Like I said, Len will be back next week. He's going to finish up his series on Matthew. And I'll come back in April and we'll start in chapter 1 of Mark, and we'll immediately get to business studying Mark.